Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Quorum Podcast. This is where academic medicine meets remote, austere, and resource-limited areas. Welcome back to the program. This is Aebhric O'Kelly. This week, we are joined by Bryony Palmer, a nurse from the UK who is currently circumnavigating the globe on her sailboat. Bryony, welcome to the program.
Hi, Aebhric. Thank you for having me.
So, tell us a bit about yourself and what's keeping you busy.
Oh, gosh. So, I am a nurse. I kind of called myself at the start kind of wilderness and offshore kind of medicine nursing. But I realised that if I say offshore, people think that's kind of oil rigs. And I just need to clarify, I have never, ever stepped foot on an oil rig. So I'm changing that to kind of blue water, because when I say offshore, what I mean is offshore sailing. So that's not just a nice coastal sailing, it'll be over 12 nautical miles, if not, the middle of the ocean, because we have crossed one already by now. And learning how to apply kind of the nursing and austere medicine onto sailboats, smaller sailboats typically, and kind of how things relate or how things need to be adjusted. So that's something that's very important to me, especially in the sailing community. It can be very hit and miss with what people's experience is, whether they've had much training before they set off. And yeah, I'd really like to upskill and adjust things to make the sailing community safer for it.
That's a good way to put it. So to differentiate between all of the offshore medics that are listening to this, the blue water medic, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I realised I was causing confusion. And obviously, if you are in the sailing, maritime community, you'll probably hear as things described as blue water sailboats. So those are the ones that you would entrust, hopefully, to get you across an ocean. I appreciate the irony in saying this, given the topic we're going to cover today, in one piece. And as a nurse, that is like what I'd like to be able to instill more of within the sailing community and improve the trainings, because there's a lot of trainings out there. And I was actually just having a chat with fellow sailor friends yesterday, and I remain convinced that there's a lot of gaps within that training and the education available that don't take those blue water scenarios and how, delayed you are for evacuation or medical assistance. I think, there's room for development still.
So before we deep dive into that, tell us about your background. You are a nurse from the UK, but tell us a bit about what you were doing.
So back when I was in the NHS, it was a small hospital I worked in. I won't name names. I started off in general medicine, but being a small hospital, you get what you're given in regards to patients and speciality. So I would turn up for work, and one patient would be a fractured neck or femur, and the other would be a gastric patient with a bleed on vasopressors and needing transfusions. So the speciality kind of went out the window there. And in the pandemic, we were the high dependency COVID unit. So I got this really broad range, and I really enjoyed being floated down to the emergency department, or as we call it, A&E, accident and emergency. A lot of people didn't, but I really loved going down there. And again, that speciality and kind of their teamwork was always exceptional. And I think if I'd stayed in the NHS, I'd have just gone for that full time. But I didn't, because we bought a sailboat. We sold everything, myself and my husband, for a 41-foot sailboat to sail around the world. And since then, so I've helped out with a couple of situations. News gets around when you're a healthcare professional in what we call kind of the cruising community. So I'll wake up to calls or friends will message if they've got a wound that they need support with. We had friends whose drinks were spiked and they were stuck on the boat because nothing had quite kicked in time for them to realise that they shouldn't have gone back in the dinghy. And also last year with Hurricane Beryl, I sent out a little WhatsApp message whilst we were sat on the outskirts in Trinidad, asking if anyone was planning on organising any response to take aid to the affected islands. And I ended up co-coordinating that response, which was a fleet of 65 sailing vessels that went in from 7 countries, 2 continents. But also alongside that, we were first on the ground. The United Nations World Food Programme, the stats kind of show that I think 20 to 50% of especially the smaller islands don't have any aid or anything received within the first 72 hours, that they have to wait a lot longer. And we were first on the ground, so we didn't just take in aid, we sent in what we call scout boats to start with to do the disaster assessments. I had contacts that were within the Grenadian government, so I was feeding back all those intel, including some major public health risks. So there's what we call the manchineel trees in the Caribbean and part of South America, and these are one of the most poisonous trees in the world. They've been used from warfare to torture and just unfortunate people who think those little apple-looking fruit look really tasty. They're really, really poisonous. And one of the big problems in Hurricane Beryl was that all the lids of people's water cisterns, their water supplies had been blown off, alongside all the twigs and the leaves and the debris on trees getting blown into them. And so people were finding that they were having like weird reactions to their water and getting really sick. And our scouts identified that it's because it was the manchineels, and every single part of that tree is poisonous. So now we've not only just got everything else, but the remaining water that people are desperate to use. If they drink, they're having really severe gastric system problems, and then they try to just wash with it, and they're getting kind of, it just came out in like burns and blisters, and contact dermatitis doesn't even really do it justice. So I was feeding these sorts of things back and working out plans and disseminating information there alongside organising the aid. So it was a really big operation, and one that I'm hugely proud of, and I am looking at trying to make that into a more formal framework moving forwards, because the sailing community is great and we're not a resource burden on those we go to assist, because we're self-containing with our sailboats. We have everything we need. So that's a real advantage for us going in and being able to help.
So this was your idea. You saw that this happened and you got 64 other boats together and you went to help.
Well, for the first time, I wasn't on the ground. I have had some experience in humanitarian settings and disaster settings alongside that. But this was the first time that I wasn't going in kind of as a volunteer, either helping with cleanup or first aid and healthcare. So I stayed in Trinidad, which was hard for me because I love being on the ground, but I couldn't coordinate the amount that needed to be coordinated if I'm also there doing that groundwork. So that was a really steep learning curve. But yeah, we had 65 vessels from Trinidad. We had one from Brazil, St. Martin, SVIs, 7 countries overall. So yeah, 65 went in, and hundreds of thousands of aid. And some people were just going in to do assessments as well and help report back. And some did multiple trips as well. So it was 65 vessels, but some did do multiple trips.
So you are going to write a book about that.
I probably should do something. I have very strong feelings. I don't think the cruising community is utilised effectively yet, but that's something that I'm working on.
So sort of a global network of blue water boats that can have a conversation, a platform to react to things like that?
Essentially, myself and 2 others that helped co-coordinate, we are putting together our pitch for a funding grant at the moment to help build the system that we need in place for that and make sure that, you know, ideally we'd be having these vessels really vetted and a bit more trained, and within that it's a good opportunity for me to be able to put out kind of, you know, the austere medicine training and other things as well, so we can upskill our sailors, but in a way that it's not just beneficial to them and their direct community, but to global disaster response as well.
So let's talk about training. So you woke up after going through the ravages of a pandemic, and you said, you know what, I'm going to have a go and circumnavigate the world. You got a sailboat. And what training did you do to prepare yourself for that?
Well, I think I should probably mention that I'm pretty sure my colleagues, whilst we were in the depth of COVID, thought that I was having a bit of a mental breakdown because I'd suddenly started talking about, buying a boat and sailing the world. And they all smiled and nodded. But when we actually sold the house and bought a boat, they were all still very surprised. So I'm not sure anyone took it seriously. I think they thought it was just a bit of a dream to get me through the pleasures of the pandemic, as it were. And I'd already been a member of World Extreme Medicine. I'd already attended some of the conferences and, you know, the workshops and things there, and some of the trainings online and webinars that they do. I read a lot. I can't sit down and read a book, but I love going down rabbit holes and learning and seeing how things can be adapted. Again, now into the sailing community. I'd already done the Wilderness First Responder, and then University of Utah have their Associate in Wilderness Medicine course as well. So I did that. And as you might know, I'm on LinkedIn. And one of the reasons I'm on there is because I'm a big believer in being a little fish in a big pond. And that's really hard to do when you're on a sailboat, because you kind of miss out on kind of, you know, that amount of colleagues and those opportunities in a way. So I love being on LinkedIn just because there's so many people there that know so much more than I do, and they'll discuss topics and they'll talk about things and I'll learn from them, and then I'll go away and I'll read up and I'll study. And for me, that's a really helpful resource, because otherwise you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's really dangerous in this field.
Agreed. So what did you do to prepare?
For the sailing?
Yes. Well, I mean, we met because of I was teaching a course at the London School. So you did the Diploma of Tropical Nursing. Tell us about that and what made you want to have a go.
That one actually was the health. I don't know if they run it anymore. It was a virtual one that they did, Healthcare in Humanitarian Crisis. I'd forgotten about that one, so thank you. And I did that that was pre-pandemic, but I'd really enjoyed it. And I'd been able to kind of apply it a little bit because I'd gone and worked I'd volunteered in Calais, colloquially known as the jungle, but I don't like to call it that just because I think that's the first step towards dehumanizing language. But it was a camp of, it's been demolished now, 10,000 externally displaced peoples with hundreds of children that were unaccompanied and on their own there. And I had a little caravan doing first aid and medical care out of. And if I needed to, I had forms that I could fill out and people would take it. And if they needed to go to I think it was the MSF kind of setup, which was outside of the camp, I could refer people if they needed x-rays or kind of more psychological counselling and things that we weren't capable of. So I'd had quite a lot of experience in that element of kind of like the low resource in practice then as well.
That's pretty interesting work. I imagine you had quite a few stories about that experience.
Yeah, everything's a grey area there. Everything was a grey area there, and often quite a dark shade of grey. So you've got to learn to just do your best and kind of sit with those decisions that you've made and know that under the circumstances, with the resources, and kind of just the challenges that were there, that you did your best. And I think a lot of people would go thinking they would stay for a long time, and after a couple of days would leave in that place because they couldn't cope. Or people would think they're going for a short time and go back and back and back again because it was important work and that place had a way of sucking people in. And it was an interesting place between having a very strong sense of community, but also being very volatile. And you see everything there. So people, that had wounds just from a lot of fires from the gas cookers that they were using. And there was unfortunately a lot of self-harm, wounds from where people were trying to get on the trucks, but also the French police. Unfortunately, there was police violence there. And I had to take one child to hospital with an intracranial bleed. And those things are quite tough. It's valuable work. And I know it's a politically heated topic, that place. It was definitely. But I went in and for me, it wasn't the politics. For me, it was giving healthcare to people that otherwise had none. So
as you were preparing for this trip, what training do you wish you would have done? Looking back on your preparation for this, what holes were there? What would you have preferred to have learned?
I mean, I'll be very honest, and obviously this is quite pertinent given the way that we got to know each other a bit better. I knew that one of the things that I wasn't really happy with was dislocations, and I'd had some training, but there's a very big difference between kind of sitting down and watching someone talk about how to handle various dislocations and show you a video where, if I recall, actually, I'm not even sure it was a real dislocation that they showed. And I remember thinking at the end of that wasn't very good. And I really hope I get some more training done before I ever have to deal with something like a dislocated shoulder. But the world works in mysterious ways, and it has a way of catching up with you. And that definitely came to bite me in the bum a little bit there, because as you know, we were under sail and my poor husband ended up with a dislocated shoulder, and try as I might, things were not going to plan.
So we can discuss that now, I guess. Let's talk about that situation of you dealing with a dislocated shoulder, and it was in the middle of the night, was it not? Storm and difficulty. What happened? Tell us what you went through then.
So we had just reached the Bahamas, which has been a dream of mine for many, many years. But we were tired because the sail there, it had been a long one. Tony had some sort of kind of gastric upset, and his sister hadn't been 100% either. So they'd not really enjoyed that sail, although there was nothing much wrong with it. It was a little choppy towards the end. And I had done a lot of extra I'd extended all of my shifts just to give Tony time to get a bit of extra sleep and rest. And his sister, Navi, who is with us, she's not a sailor anyway, so it's just myself and Tony doing watches. So we'd arrived in the Bahamas a bit tired, but then kind of gale force winds predicted up to over 30 knots were due. And we were in this little island called Inagua. which is pretty remote with a small community and only 2 anchorages, and neither of which were going to be sheltered with the change in wind direction that was due. So we decided we were going to race ahead of the gale to get to what is fondly known of as the Raggeds, or the Humantos chain. So it's a chain of islands which are super remote. Only one of them down at the very south is inhabited with a small community. They have to do their food and shopping order online, and every now and then a boat will arrive with whatever they've ordered on it. There is a runway, but I have no idea when that was last used. And all the other islands there are remote, uninhabited, but with better anchorages and shelter for the winds that were arriving. So we thought it was always our plan to go there anyway. So we headed off bright and early. I'm not having quite fully recovered from the sail to the Bahamas. I think we left before about 9 o'clock. And 10 o'clock that night, I had gone to try and finally get some sleep. I hadn't quite fallen asleep yet, unfortunately, before Tony kind of went, he was on watch, yelled, "What was that sound?" Followed with, "Oh my gosh, the dinghy." And we'd had the dinghy hoisted up on davits. It's always an interesting topic as to where one puts their dinghy when under sail. Anyway, if we're on long passages, we will usually lift it up on deck and ratchet strap it down. But there is a risk with that because the hatch at the front of the boat in the V-bow is then blocked. So if someone needs to escape from the front of the boat, they cannot. And it wasn't a long sail, so we'd hoisted it up on the davits at the back of the boat. And one of the davits had simply snapped off at the weld. And so we had a davit dragging partly in the dinghy, which was dragging, held on by the remaining davit, which also looked like it wasn't massively loving life with the pressure that it was under. Tony hove to really quickly. So for non-sailors, that's kind of a position with the sails where you're essentially just floating, really nicely balanced. You won't be sailing anywhere, you'll just be drifting. And it keeps the boat a lot more stable. So it's a storm technique as well, which is usually very effective. And if people are really in a lot of heavy weather and desperately need to sleep, they'll hove to give them some opportunity to rest. So we hove to and started drifting, trying to work out now how we're going to secure the dinghy ideally, how many lines are in the water, because a big risk of lines in the water is that it can get trapped around the rudder and you can lose steerage, which is obviously unsafe and would be disastrous. And, there's always options like, do you just cut the dinghy and cut as many lines as you can find? But being sailors, there's a degree of accountability to not A, leave any rubbish or anything in the ocean, but B, something like a dinghy, and also got an aluminium bottom to it as well, is a navigational hazard to other boats. And we would never want to leave anything that could put anyone else in danger, because we'd be absolutely horrified if something had happened, if we just cut the dinghy and another boat that was also on the way potentially to the Raggeds or anywhere else eventually became in trouble as a result. So we got out as many lines as we could, but we knew that there were still a few that we hadn't quite managed to reach. We wanted to try and find a way to secure the dinghy, tie it up to take the pressure off the last davit and make sure that we could just tow it behind. So Tony stood on the ladder at the back of the boat. The cockpit doesn't go all the way back to the back of our boat. We've got a centre cockpit, which is great for heavy weather sailing, but not so good when you've got a dinghy dragging behind you at the back of the boat in a way you don't want it to be. So the ladder is partly secured, the top half, to the transom, which is the official word for that back bit of the boat. And the second half of that ladder is on hinges, so you can kind of raise it up and down, so you can fold it in half when you're not using it when you're sailing, and then you can put the rest of it down, and it dangles a little bit into the water as well, so if you're swimming or trying to just get in and out normally. But unfortunately that meant that when Tony was on the ladder, he was even trying to see maybe if he could pull the dinghy in to get into it a little bit to secure and find those last lines that were from it that we couldn't find. Some swell came through, the boat went up a bit, but the ladder went up that he was stood on even more, and then it came crashing back down. And he'd been holding on with his right arm, and he just screamed, and he had managed to get a pretty nice anterior shoulder dislocation as a result of that. And
he'd done it once before in the army, is that right?
Yes. He stacked it when skiing with the military in Austria, bless him. And they'd given him a grand total of 1 ibuprofen before shipping him. I was horrified, Aebhric. I was horrified. Before shipping him off to this tiny little clinic where 2 guys held him down and the third one popped it in pretty quickly. And he said, compared to what I was trying to do to the poor boy, pretty painlessly in comparison. But it was only 1 ibuprofen. up until that point, it was back in. It sounds like that was not really sufficient from his description. But yeah, he had done it once before, and that was in 2016, and he'd had no issues, no any identified weakness or anything since then.
So what happened? What happened then?
Well, my first thought was, let's get him back up onto the boat, because my concern was, and I was correct, that there might be some vasovagal syncope attempt, and I did not want a man overboard situation, especially not if he's got a dislocated shoulder and at risk of losing consciousness. So I helped drag him back up and into the cockpit, which I said is a centre cockpit, which I love because it's so much safer and more secure, and I'm a big believer in centre cockpits for anyone that does do offshore or blue water sailing. At which point he did say, yeah, I'm beginning to feel a bit faint. So we lay him down, and he didn't lose consciousness, but you could see that he would have been on his way to that pretty quickly. Obviously we got him out of his life jacket. We did kind of the assessments to make sure that neurovascular compromisation was obviously a key risk. His arm did look pretty white. I know I told you about this, Aebhric, and we had a bit of a brief panic. Then we looked at the other hand. I said, well, that's white too. And then we looked at his face, and I was like, okay, the poor boy's just white. I think we're okay. But we did continue to monitor that, obviously. And he was, it's interesting because it's very hard when you're not in a hospital setting and you're not even kind of working as a nurse or healthcare professional. Like this boat is our home. And so kind of switching straight from just being, the sailor, the wife at home into a healthcare professional mode isn't easy when you're still at home. But yeah, we did those assessments and just trying to get in, and he's just saying, put it back in. So we tried, and he screamed more because those spasms were just so severe. And I said, look, it's not going to go. I can't get it straight back in. We do need to do this in a more structured manner. So we started analgesics, but also massaging, which was a really effective non-pharmacological method of managing those spasms, which was really good and very effective, and also helped him, I think, calm down a little bit because we're just massaging and talking and waiting for analgesics to kick in. So that was the start. And then we continued to try. We tried various methods, kind of gentle traction on the arm and that rotation. But every time we tried, you could just see those spasms coming back, and he was screaming. And it's very hard when it's your husband. That's not in the wedding vows, that bit. And kind of and I'll be honest, like the emotional effects that has on me when, that's your husband. He's my rock. And that's really hard as well, just to kind of work out, how much you're kind of not wanting to push through as such, especially because I knew that this wasn't my strongest asset when it comes to my training. So there was a bit of moral injury there alongside just trying to manage it clinically, but also know that this isn't my clinically strongest skill set, and you have to be humble and safe enough to know when that's the case.
So what did you do then?
And it was quite obvious that we were not going to be able to get it back in very easily. And we put out a pan, and absolutely nobody responded. And we were offshore. We're still in Bahamian waters technically, and you'll find that a lot of countries will have the receivers and everything, and for that high up so that all their waters are monitored. In the Bahamas and a lot of other countries, they just don't have those means, and they don't. There was no response to the pan. We did have Starlink internet, so we ended up going through a roundabout way of getting hold of the Coast Guard through that. And we should have our medical patch being the Falmouth Centre, because we're a UK registered vessel and they've got 24/7 medical assistance. But unfortunately, no matter how many people we had to get in touch with them and say, look, this is their situation, they want some assistance, we never heard back from them. We did have an email acknowledging that they knew about us, and all they wanted was a medical patch, but it wasn't happening. So wow. I put out the call on LinkedIn, knowing that a lot of people are in different time zones and we're waking up hopefully in a few hours' time, and might be able to offer some further advice and support or techniques or thoughts, because at this point I'm now captain and I'm having to solo sail for the first time in my life with a gale developing, fixing a couple of bits of the boat, which things break at the worst of times, as they do. Consequently becoming quite seasick, and for me that's largely fatigue. I do become a lot more vulnerable to seasickness when tired, and I was becoming increasingly sleep deprived throughout the night. So there was a lot going on there. Tony's sister Navi, she's a nurse. She was a newly qualified A&E nurse for a year, and she did a great job kind of helping look after him so that I could try and focus a bit more as well on the sailing. And I was desperate for her to have some support and further input, because if I'm sailing, I can't help Tony. And just having someone else that, can offer support and is there if we need, it's reassuring to start. It's nice to feel like you're not on your own, but also just with that clinical support. So yeah. And that was what I would say was a huge thing, is I really felt like we were on our own. And when you feel like you're on your own going through that, it's, there's a lot of emotions and you have to try and keep on top of that. And it's not easy. And that impacts just all your cognitive ability and can override all those clinical things that you think's ingrained in you. And suddenly you realize perhaps it's not as ingrained as you think it is.
So how long was it until you started hearing back from your requests?
I think it was probably around 3 a.m. when we first got a couple of messages through. And I think it was around 4 a.m. when you very, very kindly called. I looked back on WhatsApp and I think it was about 4 a.m. our end. So you were struck with a very tired, stressed crew, Navi feeling seasick, and me having to angle the phone away from me when trying to talk to you so that I could be sick into the sink, which was highly undignified. And I can only apologise once again, but it happens. So yeah, very tired and being stuck on the bow trying to fix our, a furling line for a while with waves to the face was never a very good mix.
There's a lot going on. It would make everyone or anyone in that situation having to deal with all those variables at once. It just wasn't easy.
No. And I think my attempts at documentation showed that. I've got a half-written kind of ship's vessel log. I'm not even sure what happened, but it's only half-written. I remember thinking we need to try and document, but everything is very fragmented. And I think that just shows the amount that you're trying to juggle at once. It was really hard to get through one task without another needing to take over and redirect you. So there was a lot going on. But clinically, in regards to that care with Tony, I think under the circumstances, we did pretty well. So with analgesics, there's the paracetamol and the ibuprofen. And then I was trying to consider in regards to the form of opiates. And again, I debriefed with you about this because I wasn't sure if I was making the right decision or not, if I had made the right decision or not. We do have opiates on board. We've got there's tablet forms, codeine, and we've also got for injection, we've got tramadol and we have morphine. But the problem is, and I've hopefully got some coming my way now, is that there was a shortage of naloxone in the UK. So the people that could provide me with the opiates actually couldn't give me naloxone, although I appreciate it's only partially effective against tramadol anyway. And the last thing I wanted was to be dealing with a potential overdose on top of everything else and not be able to. So that was a really huge safety element there. And Tony's never had any opiates before. But also just that I didn't really want him sedated because the sea state's picking up, the boat's moving more. He needs to be alert enough to, help keep himself stable to a degree. And, if something really serious happened or just getting him up into the cockpit towards the end to get him off the boat, we weren't sure what that was going to look like. I needed him alert and able to manage because he's only got one hand to hold on with now. But also, again, the nausea because, as I said, Navi felt seasick. I was being profusely seasick. And all those nerves, those ligaments, those muscles are already being really, really stretched for a protracted amount of time. And with those spasms, and he's now vomiting on top of that and with the extra spasms. I know that vomiting can exacerbate back injuries. I really didn't want him vomiting with a dislocated shoulder on top. So I decided not to go for anything IM. And instead, we gently started titrating with the codeine just to see how he fared with that. And he did fare pretty well, actually. He tolerated it really nicely, but it was a much safer, less effective, perhaps as an analgesic, but it was a safer method of introducing opiates and seeing how we get on with that. And then after the first dose of ibuprofen, we switched to naproxen because people find that often more effective, but also we need to give less doses in time frame. So it kind of meant that it was easier for me to carry on with the sailing and less time needed to spend topping him up with pain relief because it was longer lasting.
Plus the paracetamol would react with the codeine in a synergistic effect.
Yes. We don't have any cocodamol on board. It's just, we don't need it because we do have both. But, that is always an option. And when people talk about analgesics, I do kind of run through that with them. We've not opted for it ourselves, but yeah, they work really well together. And with that and the massaging, he did eventually doze off. And I think, well, if someone wasn't the best sleep of his life, I'm sure. But if someone can doze off, then you know that, you're doing pretty well with the analgesics. You don't want to sedate them. It's not safe. But if someone can just manage to fall asleep, then I think you've done a pretty good job.
Yeah. So I wasn't able to coax you through reducing the shoulder But did you find anything that to reduce the pain a bit?
So other than the analgesics and the non-pharmaceutical massage and just reassurance, that position that you had with the weights and him in the tripod position, whilst it didn't reduce the shoulder, he found it to be such a relief. And I was talking to him about it the other day. He was like, yeah, I just felt like it took that tension off. I could feel everything relaxing. And so he just kept doing that intermittently. And I should really send you across the photos, because he was still even doing that when he got back to land, to the tiny medical clinic, because we had to go back to Inagua, and they couldn't reduce it either. But he was still there in the hospital doing that, because it was just such a relief, kind of positionally and helping relax things. But yeah, just kind of positioning for comfort as well really assisted him. And I think he looked a bit better after he had some food. And I'm a big believer in, if someone's in kind of a degree of emotional distress or panic attacks or that flight and fight response, feeding them, because if someone was in real danger, they wouldn't stop to eat. I always think, and I've always seen it as a bit of a reset very successfully in a lot of patients as well in the past, is if someone can sit and eat something, it's kind of telling them psychologically, telling them themselves that they probably don't need to be trying to run away from anything. And he did seem to relax after he'd had his breakfast.
So who finally put it in? How did he finally get reduced?
Oh, well, we got back to land around 4:30 in the afternoon the following day, exhausted and stressed, but we got to land. And where we ended up in the harbour was just a stone's throw from a little medical clinic there. Unfortunately, in Inagua, what happened is they'd built a whole hospital, but it's so remote as an island with such a small community and not a lot going on that they could never attract the staff. So it was closed. There was nobody in there. And medical professionals who had been alerted to the fact that he was on his way still had to be called in. And so there were some doctors and there were some nurses, but they weren't confident trying to reduce it. They did have an x-ray machine, but obviously nobody to work it. So, and I didn't think that it was likely to have a fracture. And I know that with you as well, we did a bit more assessment for that, even though it was a distracting injury, which was a risk. I think with the mechanism of an injury, that was a low risk, but understandably, they perhaps put that into their consideration. And unfortunately, then we had a little bit of a battle with persuading the insurance that a shoulder dislocation on a remote island, with Tony being the only person in the entire hospital and the staff there not being confident to reduce it, warrants medevac. So it took 24 hours in the end, and me hassling the British Embassy and others for support before everything finally was given the go-ahead and paid for, and he was medevaced to Nassau. So it was 48 hours or so after injury where they reduced it under general anaesthesia.
Oof, wow. That's a Herculean event.
It was a rough one. And yeah, I mean, I think, we've been in really challenging situations before, really challenging, much bigger seas and serious events where we're overpowered, and because you sail enough nautical miles, things do go wrong. And I could beat myself up as much as I like, but you do something long enough, the wrong call gets made or you get caught out by the weather. But we've always had each other, and I think that was the key difference. That he was in so much pain, and understandably not. Even when the pain was reduced, his shoulder is still out, and he was very anxious about that. And he did say, he called me over at one point, and he was like, "What was that thing about if your shoulder's out for like a really long time?" I said, "I think that's the first time I've ever lied to him." And I just said, "Oh, it can just make it a little bit more difficult to get it back in." Because there's no point me talking him through kind of, the long-term risks and disabilities and things that could happen, because I didn't really see that was the right degree of holistic care. It wasn't the time to be that honest. Although he does say now that he knew I was lying. So I'm not sure why he asked me anyway.
Blame the drugs.
But he had a lot on his mind, and even when he had much better analgesia and was looking a bit more comfortable, I was still very much on my own in other ways. And that's a rough introduction to solo sailing, and the boat isn't quite set up in a way that's ideal for solo sailing. We have talked about having more lines and things run to the cockpit so that if we need to reef the mainsail, you don't have to go up to the mast and things, so it's safer and easier. But we haven't done that yet, mostly due to finances. There's a lot of restrictions there, and nothing on a boat is cheap. No, roller foilings are not cheap at all to have everything running aft. I understand that. Yeah. Yeah. So
looking back on this, what would you tell yourself, or what would you tell anyone else who's about ready to go out on a blue water, multi-year circumferential navigation of this amazing globe that we have. And what advice would you give that person?
I mean, I wish I'd followed my own advice a bit more, because I'd long said, we both need to have practice solo sailing the vessel, even as is, so that, when injuries inevitably happen, it doesn't suddenly feel like the first time you're doing it. And I wish that we'd done that a little bit more, because we hadn't. So even though, we can do everything so efficiently with the two of us, suddenly doing it on your own, it feels different. And if you're used to doing things as a pair and you're suddenly down to 50% capacity, the anxiety that can induce, and just the extra workload and having to navigate that at a time where obviously something's gone really wrong, can be really hard to work through. So yeah, I don't care if there's 2 people or 10 people, know how to do as much as possible on your own, so that when something does go wrong, it's not the first time that you're trying to navigate that experience. It's a huge thing for me.
So a couple day trips perhaps before you started out.
Yeah, I mean, and actually when we bought the boat and first set off, we were green. We were really new sailors. Tony had done a little with the military, and he'd done his day skipper, and we'd done together 10 days on like a sailing adventure trip on someone else's boat in Scotland. And we'd also sailed from the UK to Gibraltar on someone else's boat, on an elderly skipper's boat, helping him. But, that was the first time that we were on our own boat, dealing with everything on our own. So we were really new, but we did go make quite a big conscious effort, especially for the Atlantic crossing, being like, we can't just, and we have a lot of friends that just marina hopped up until the day that they were like, right, we now need to get to the Canaries, which is a big sail from the Med, and then across the Atlantic. And they'd never done more than day sailing between marinas. And whereas we had done the complete opposite. We had raced across the Med and back slightly too hard because we were tired and we were skinny. But we had been out in all weathers, and we'd learnt so much, and we knew more about heavy weather sailing. So we'd taken a lot of time and pushed ourselves to make sure that, even though it might look like not a massive time frame, we'd significantly covered a lot of thousands of nautical miles on our own boat before that endeavour. I'm very glad that we did, because the Atlantic crossing was a pretty rough one. And we handled that fine. But yeah, one of the key things is, don't just marina hop. Don't stick to your comfort zone until there's a point where you could find yourself well out of it, and well out of any way that you can get assistance if you need, because we do know people that did. And have a good medical kit on board.
With a wee bit of training.
With some training, yes. When we were crossing the Atlantic, actually, I think it was people that crossed around the same time, maybe just after us. I don't know them personally, but we have friends that do. And there were 3 on board. There was the skipper, his wife, and a crew member. The skipper was by far the most experienced sailor. And my understanding is that his wife has a deep phobia of water. So it's an interesting mix. And he was in the cockpit holding on to the mainsail sheet, which runs between the traveller and the boom, and they accidentally jibed, and he was holding on with it a bit behind him. And next thing he knows, within seconds, they're out at sea and he's got an open fracture somewhere in his arm. And all they had on board was ibuprofen and luckily a broad spectrum antibiotic. And he had to do about 2+ weeks at sea with, an open fracture. So you'd be amazed what people set off with, or without, more so.
It sounds to me like somebody needs to make a blue water medic training course.
It does. It is yet another project that I've been mulling over, and again actually chatted about with friends yesterday, because there are courses out there, but, and again our friends they'd done one, and she said that she'll do a refresher before they do the Pacific crossing. And I was asking about it. I won't name names, but it's one that also a lot of professional mariners and captains and people have to do. And I was saying that, okay, so they talk about like wound care, and she said, tourniquets. And I said, do they talk to you about what you do after the tourniquet's on? And she was like, oh, what do we do? And they don't. No. And so they're teaching all these people about how to put on a tourniquet, and none of them walk away ever having heard of tourniquet conversion.
That's so dangerous.
This is and it's a big course, and I won't name names, but I cannot get over. I was like, well, that's useless, because you're probably just killing them more slowly and more painfully, because, that tourniquet can be on for, if you're out at sea, days to weeks, and all the complications that come with that. I said, I think it's probably a nicer death just to let them bleed out. And because they're not teaching, and they will end up dying. And I think it's really neglectful. And I find this is that they teach these things without sufficient consideration of the context where it will be applied. And even maritime courses, they're not teaching, prolonged field care. I think is unfathomable.
I agree. Wow, that's maybe something we have to look at. There's the name Offshore in the name of our college. Perhaps we should maybe look at some blue water medic courses.
I would be down for that, Aebhric. I'm yet to find one that I think is anywhere near sufficient, and I've deep dived into quite a lot. Some do fantastic things, but I think there's just a lack of appreciation for the context and the scene safety elements, and just, they take the standard protocols and procedures and guidelines and they teach those, but they don't adapt them sufficiently.
Bryony, my final question for you is this, and this is something that I ask every guest. What advice do you have for the new medic, a new nurse, a new doc who is just starting out on their career in austere medicine?
Think outside the box, because there's always something that someone hasn't done or looked at or considered. And I mean, for me, I'm in a really privileged position because I live outside of the box. It's a very alternative lifestyle. I live on a sailboat. I'm technically no fixed abode in a lot of ways. But with that and finding this really unique experiences will not just teach you so much, but it shows you what work is yet to be done. And so don't be afraid to really put yourself into those environments where other people aren't going, and just, learn to think outside the box, because there is so much that can be done, and not just for the environment and the context that those communities or those people might be in, but what you can also take back if you ever want to, return to the NHS or anything. You develop so much more skill set and so much more. It doesn't always need to be that really lateral thinking. So there's a whole load more that needs to be added yet, and I'd love to see more people doing it.
That's good advice. And it's been lovely having a chat with you and re-looking at a difficult situation you had, and you went through this and you did what you're supposed to do. You treated what you're supposed to treat, and you handled a very difficult situation graciously. And it was lovely to hear your story.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for calling and supporting, because when you feel really alone, it's amazing how much a face down WhatsApp can make you feel a hell of a lot better. So thank you so much again for your own support within that situation.
This has been a presentation from the College of Remote and Offshore Medicine. If you would like to earn CPD credits for this podcast, you can join the Council of Members. Being a member of the college gives you free CPD credit, free access to our virtual field guide, and discounts on our e-learning courses. You can join the team on our college website at quorum.edu.mt.